Okay, let's jump into the study, eschatology, a biblical study of end-time events. My name is Zaro Ben Lyman Hanavi, and as always, as you can see on your screen, just real quick, we're in topic number 7, the highlighted part, Excursus, the Islamic Antichrist, per Joel Richardson. We're borrowing the notes that are available online for free. This is a book that he wrote, and you can, of course, buy it at Amazon.com if you'd like to support Mr. Richardson's ministry. And yet, in his generosity, he has made it available for free at his own website, as well as free at the alternate resources that deal with this type of topic like, say, Islamic, evangelism and things like that. So we're borrowing the notes from one of those resources. But in case you didn't know, look in the description of the videos for my eschatology series, and I've listed links to those resources in the description. So without further ado, we are now ready to begin talking about this topic about the Mahdi and the attack of Jerusalem and the establishment of the Islamic Caliphate from Jerusalem. Just a brief refresher. Remember, I'll only take like 30 seconds to do this or so. The Bible describes 3 main end times figures, and this parallels the Quran and Islamic writings like the Hadith. It parallels their description and prediction of 3 main figures that are also supposed to hit the scene. I'll put a little graphic on screen in post-production so you can see this. I believe on the left side of the screen will be the Islamic figures, and on the right side of the screen I believe will be the biblical figures, if I remember correctly. But we have the Islamic Mahdi, which is a kind of a good guy in Islamic prophecy, and he's a leader, and he's a religious leader. He's a someone who is supposedly chosen by Allah to come to earth and establish worldwide Islam. And his parallel in biblical prophecy is actually the Antichrist, which to Bible students is a bad guy. He's not a good guy. Now, we already know that the world will be deceived in thinking that he's a good guy, a man of peace, and he will appear so for a good short time. A good short time? That's kind of an oxymoron. A short amount of time, but it'll be very significant is what I'm trying to convey. And yet, he's a bad guy. Going back over to the Islamic model, or the Islamic side of the discussion, we have a second figure that shows up on the scene in the end of days, and he is the Muslim Jesus. He goes by the name Isa, which is Arabic for Jesus, and he's also a good guy. Muslims are looking forward to his return. His description is similar to the Jesus of the Bible, and yet he's decidedly stripped of his divinity. He's stripped of his atoning power on the cross, meaning he didn't die for the sins of humanity, etc., etc. So he's still a great prophet. He's still a good teacher, but he is subordinate to the Mahdi. He's going to be kind of a junior, and that's one of the characters that shows up in the end of days. His parallel in biblical prophecy, surprisingly, is not Jesus Christ himself. Instead, the parallel to the Islamic Jesus is the false prophet mentioned in the book of Revelation. That's the one-to-one correlation there. And then the last figure who's going to show up on the scene, we're not really talking about these last 2. We're only talking mainly about this first one, this Mahdi. But the final figure that shows up in Islam, he is a figure known as the Dajjal, and he's the bad guy. He's the villain of the piece, right? He's the antagonist. He's the one that's going to do battle against the first 2 characters that are mentioned in Islam. And his one-to-one parallel counterpart in biblical prophecy is Jesus himself, Yeshua. Yeah. So this is where it gets really upsetting for people who study prophecy. And it's really going to be disappointing for Muslims when that day comes, because in their view, this Dajjal character, who's a bad guy, turns out to be a parallel to Jesus. And in fact, even in Islamic prophecy, this Dajjal claims to be Jesus and claims to follow Christianity, and wins a lot of Christians and Jews over to his brand of religion, which is not Islam, which according to Islam is a false religion, right? A competitive religion, but it's not true religion. Remember, this is the Islamic perspective of this bad character, this enemy of of Allah, etc., etc. And so the really dangerous and sad part is that because when Yeshua, who is the biblical counterpart to the Dajjal, when Yeshua actually does show up, many Muslims are already kind of prepped to reject him as a bad guy just right out of the gate because of the deception that Satan is using to pull the wool over their eyes, using the tool known as Islam itself. So this is the topic that we're talking about. Again, remember, this is not a slam on Islam, nor some complete expose or some kind of review of Islam, of anything like that. It's not an attack on Muslims as a whole or anything like that. We're just looking at this model of Antichrist through the lens of the Islamic picture that's painted by not just Joel Richardson. He's not the only one that embraces this particular model, but he's the one of the more prominent teachers, vocal voices. So here we go. Mr. Richardson's book, The Mahdi's Attack of Jerusalem and the Establishment of the Islamic Caliphate from Jerusalem. So we know that, biblically speaking, not just from Islam's prophecies, but from the Bible itself, the Antichrist will one day establish Jerusalem as one of his headquarters, if not the main headquarters there in the Middle East, for at least a short time period. So let's read about those details. Likewise, the Mahdi is said to attack Jerusalem and reconquer it for Islam in order that the new Islamic rule over the earth will be established from Jerusalem. And again, as I interject, I find this kind of interesting yet slightly disturbing that Islam could possibly play the part that the Antichrist needs to bring in this great deception that's going to sweep across the earth at the end of time, where there will be unified religion or unified government, unified politics, etc. One world government, one world religion, the new world order that we're describing. Islam, for a while, could very well be that tool that Satan uses to usher in many of his own agendas, which are decidedly anti-God, anti-biblical, anti-Christian, anti-Jewish, right? Anti-Semitic as well. And yet, the truth of the matter that the Bible establishes is that one day the true Messiah will rule from planet Earth, but from Jerusalem. He will also establish his rulership, his throne in Jerusalem. So the devil has borrowed many of the themes and concepts and details from the Bible, turned them on their head in this great deception and great lie to deceive those of wicked humanity and rebellious humanity who have aligned themselves in a place where they're rejecting God and rejecting God's truth of the Bible and rejecting God's Messiah. They're setting themselves up unwittingly to receive the lies of Satan that have been put forth over and over again, and yet are going to come to their fullness in the end of days. Let's read this quote from within Mr. Richardson's book. I believe it's a quote from probably an Islamic resource. It reads, quote, "Armies carrying black flags will come from Iran or Khorasan. No power will be able to stop them, and they will finally reach Elah, the Dome of the Rock in Jerusalem, where they will erect their flags." And if I look at that footnote, I think it is from an Islamic source. I'm quite certain. It might even be the Quran or one of the Hadith writings. So let's keep reading this quote within Joel Richardson's book. "Jerusalem," it says, "will be the location of the rightly guided caliphate and the center of Islamic rule, which will be headed by Imam al-Mahdi." Remember, the Mahdi, one of his nicknames as a religious figure, is the 12th Imam. So this is just the expectation from within a good section or segment of Islamic religious and devoted Muslims theology. So eschatology is going in that direction. And as we've already seen, it will continue to see, it is very unfortunate that that brand of eschatology within Islamic circles, as it reaches very concentrated kind of what I might label as devoted or radicalized Muslim opinions tends to always end up being not just anti-God and anti-Christian, but it also ends up being anti-Jewish and anti-Semitic. So isn't it just like the spirit of Satan to level his hate against God, against God's Messiah, against God's truth of the Bible? And then when it comes to people groups, to level his intense wrath against Israel and her offspring, like we read in Revelation chapter 12, the offspring who name the name of Yeshua as their Lord and hold to the commandments of God. So that's the position that we're looking at, is not just Christians, but as Jews. And so we can see that, isn't that interesting that this type of poison is already brewing in Islamic theology, and many Muslims, many peace-loving Muslims the world over, are probably not even aware that that type of sentiment exists in their eschatology. Let's keep reading Joel Richardson. Also, Joel says, as we just saw in the section above, the Mahdi will not end his campaign against Jerusalem in a peaceful way. For the Jews, the Islamic version of the last days ends with the last few surviving Jews hiding behind rocks or trees from the sword of Islam. We already know from history that this has been kind of almost like tested out, where Islam down through the centuries has forcibly converted people, convert to Islam or die. And so that type of conquest and expansion of their empire and their caliphate has not been something that has been hidden from history. So it's already been done before. Why not reuse it? Satan likes to reuse programs that wicked rulers and kings have done in the past for his own agenda. So why should this be any different? Joel Richardson continues, the military campaign against Jerusalem and the establishment of the Islamic Caliphate there likewise will not result in a benevolent rule over the Jews by the Mahdi. For as we've already seen, the last quote above continues, and so now he's going to pull a quote from that same resource. And here's the rest of that quote, picking up the thought again. That will abolish the leadership of the Jews and put an end to the domination of the Satans who spit evil into people and cause corruption in the earth. And again, we're seeing how disturbing that kind of prophetic or sentiment is if you're a Christian and someone who loves Israel and supports Israel and believes that Israel has a prominent place in God's timetable in the end of days. And of course, if you're Jewish, or especially if you're an Israeli living in the land of Israel, living near Jerusalem, those words that I just read should be very shocking and disturbing to you. Let's keep reading Joel Richardson. He says, in relation to the above attack against the inhabitants of Israel, there's quite interestingly another very specific correlation between the actors of the Mahdi and the actions of the biblical Antichrist. Remember, as I mentioned earlier, the one-to-one parallel between this figure known as the Mahdi, a religious figure, and yet still a leader by his own right in Islam, but not necessarily, I think, not necessarily a political or military genius. I'm not 100% sure, and I'm not a specialist in Islamic eschatology, but from what I've gleaned from the amount of research that it takes to put these studies together, I believe that he's more of a religious figure. But when we're looking at the Antichrist, the biblical Antichrist has his foothold not just in religion, at least temporarily as a tool, as far as it will further his agenda. In other words, he's going to throw it off halfway through the 70th week of Daniel. But for the Antichrist, primarily, the Antichrist has a lot of interest in military weapons, in military campaigns, in dominating areas using his military might. And also, he seems to have a heavy hand in politics at the end of the day when it comes time for him to influence people groups and leaders and kings and presidents and prime ministers, etc. He's going to have this supernatural ability to persuade people with half-truths, half-lies, with, convincing, persuasive speech, empty promises, etc., etc. So Joel Richardson he's going to start unpacking some of these details for us, I believe, if I remember from when I read this earlier. He talks about the parallels between these two figures, Mahdi and Antichrist, and he continues by saying, while the similarities between the Antichrist and the Mahdi that we have already discussed are quite astonishing, he says, I believe that the specificity of this next parallel is just simply incredible. So let's begin to unpack some more details where there are parallels between the Islamic model of end times, the Islamic descriptions and expectations of their eschatology model, and the biblical model or biblical descriptions and details given in end time prophecies and eschatology as a whole. So we have this topic now labeled the Antichrist's 7-year treaty with Israel. And of course, this is going to carry us right back into Daniel again. All right, which of course we prepped for months ago. All right, let's read Joel Richardson. He says, after rising to power and as a prelude to his invasion of Israel, the Antichrist is said to initiate a treaty with the nation of Israel for 7 years. So, of course, this is biblical truth that we believe is trustable, reliable. Let's read the Bible. Quote, this is Daniel. He will confirm a covenant with many for 1/7. This is Daniel chapter 9, starting in verse 24, 25, 26. Starting around verse 24, 25, some if I remember. He'll confirm a covenant with many for 1/7. In the middle of the 7, he will put an end to sacrifice and offering. And on a wing of the temple, he will set up an abomination that causes desolation. And of course, these words are echoed by our Lord Yeshua in Matthew and Mark and in Luke. Daniel continues, after he sets up this abomination and causes desolation, until the end that is decreed is poured out on him. Daniel 9:27. So I said it was 24, 25, 26. Turns out it's the very last verse. Now, what can we glean from this passage in the book of Daniel? Let's let Mr. Richardson add his own comments. In context, Joel says, this verse shows us that the Antichrist will establish a quote-unquote covenant with Israel for 7 years. Now, that's according to most biblical prophecy experts looking at the Hebrew behind what Daniel talked about and gaining the context from not just Daniel, but substantiated by other scriptures, that there's this final period of history that is intensely focused on allowing evil, wicked humanity and rebellious humans to be fooled by the figure known as Antichrist and his false Messiah, led by Satan, of course. And all of these events will transpire within a 7-year time frame. And the 7 years itself is divided, I'll put a little graphic on the screen so you can see this. The 7 years itself is divided into 3.5 and 3.5 years. 1,260 days times 2, 42 months times 2, times, and half a times, multiplied times 2. Thus, we get to 7 years, or the 70th week, which seems to make a lot of sense because Daniel already prophesied earlier in 9:24 through 27, or earlier on if you were to go back up into your own Bible and read the first verses. He's been told by the angel that 70 weeks, 77s are decreed upon your people. And then given all of the details that are spelled out in this prophecy, there's no way that there could really be 7 literal weeks. The time frame is much too short for all of these events to transpire. Thus, Bible teachers have looked at this word 7 and realized that it is a unit of 7 that has to be determined from context. And the best model, the best contextual description is the 70 years of 70 sets of 7 years. Like I said, it could be 7 weeks, could be 7 months, could be 7 something, 7 cycles of 7, 7 sabbaticals, 7 Shemitah years, etc., etc. But 77s of 7 years, 70 years, so 490 years in total seems to be the best way to understand that. So Joel's going to continue to look at how that in Islam, there is this eerie parallel between the Bible's 7-year prediction of what's going to happen and Islam itself. I believe that, if I remember, I'm spoiling it for you, so just plug your ears if you don't want to hear. I believe that the reason there's that parallel is because when Muhammad compiled the Quran, and later on the Hadith was formed as well, that there was this direct borrowing of details from the Bible, which is why we have some of the parallels that exist. It wasn't just coincidence. It wasn't that Satan was whispering into the ear of Muhammad during those times and rattling off scripture. I mean, that did take place, and yet they thought it was an angel, right? Go figure. Gabriel. Yet what we know is that, if I remember, Muhammad was illiterate, and yet he borrowed what he remembered from parts of the Bible. In fact, one part of the Islamic prophecies, if I remember, directly even mentions the book of Revelation.